Welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to the most important and to the fastest growing segment of society. To those who have finally come to realize that the world's political, religious, military, economic, media, and academic institutions are corrupt, that most have become counterproductive, and that they cannot be fixed. Our mission, therefore, is to know who is working against our interest, to understand how and why they are doing so, because exposing and condemning such schemes isn't hateful, it's caring. In our concluding hour, we're going to use evidence and reason to explore the wide divide between Paul's letter to the Galatians and Yahushua's testimony, to demonstrate that if one is true, the other is not. We would encourage you to participate in this program anytime over the next 3 hours. Our line is toll-free, 877-300-7645. I'd like to spend some time talking about what happened in Santa Barbara area, in Galita, in Isla Vista, on Friday evening, what has happened subsequently with the death of 6 innocent young men and women, the manifesto of a deranged individual, his death as well, and other statements surrounding what occurred. And truthfully, as it relates to the shooter, there is a lot known, none of which is material. However, turning this into a political cause, one of the victim's fathers, a young man minding his own business, going in for a quick and inexpensive dinner in a local deli there in the Isla Vista residential suburb of UCSB, was gunned down. His father, obviously emotionally a mess, as you would expect, laid out a message that began reasonable enough, but didn't end that way. And I want to start with his words. Speaking of his son, he said he was a really great kid whose death has left our family lost and broken. I suspect Richard Martinez's family was lost and broken before the death of their son, although the death of their son is indeed tragic. I suspect he was a really good kid. And there is nothing that he did that deserves having his life snuffed out. I'm going to continue with what Richard Martinez said, because it has been played in the national media, first with him standing with his press conference enraged, and then secondarily, a day or two later, when he's very calm and presenting the same idea, but without any of the emotion. He said, our family has a message for every parent out there. You don't think it will happen to your child until it does. Now, he's not talking about the random death of his son. He's talking about what he considers to be a direct consequence of the U.S. Constitution, of Republicans who, more than Democrats, stand for that Constitution, and for against the NRA, who he thinks murdered his son. Why did Chris die? That was his son's name. Now, the answer to that question is very straightforward. And before I tell you what he had to say, for those who have taken a few moments, as I did, to read bits and pieces of the shooter's My Twisted World, They know that the young man that took his son's life was deranged. He was out of his mind. He wasn't enraged, however. I mean, that's one of the things he uses terms that would indicate that you'd have to be enraged, and yet he videotaped himself the day of and the day before carrying out his murderous rampage. There's literally no emotion in his voice. There's no expression of rage on his face. It's almost as if he's drugged. I suspect, since he was seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I don't know which one, although the man's name has been published, that he was medicated. He was out of his mind. There are those that are out of their mind. Now, his personal rage was all self-centered. And the reason we're not going to talk about his twisted world is because it was his twisted world. Just one individual who was frustrated over not getting enough sex. In fact, he didn't get any sex. And so, rather than hold himself accountable, and he chose to blame women. Now, before we move on and talk about what killed Chris Martinez, come to realize that that a big part of this young man's problem wasn't his appearance. He blamed it on the fact that he was of mixed race. He was Eurasian. I find some of the most attractive people in the world are Eurasian. He was a handsome-looking kid. That wasn't the problem. The problem is when you listen to him speak and when you read what he's written, he was out of touch with how one interacts with others. And to a large degree, this has been created by the imaginary world of social media, by Twitter and by Facebook. And, of course, he was users of those genres. He posted his manifesto on his websites, on his social interaction pages. And so when he was communicating, he was part of this make-believe world. And in a make-believe world, it's much easier to have enemies without substance, to vilify those that you do not know. And that's what he did. To a large extent, it really is a consequence of this non-personal world where you have very little contact with people and your communication is in the ether of the internet. A great tool is improperly deployed. So to answer Richard Martinez's question as to why did Chris die, it's because one young man became overly fixated on self-gratification, and he lost his ability to be rational, and he lashed out. He thought that he was the hero in the story. He thought by killing that he proved that he was bigger. He just lost the ability to be rational. Was it drugs that drove him to this? I don't know. Could it have been prescription drugs, as has been the case with so many of the mass murderers? Don't know that either. Certainly a possibility. If you listen to his rant, without emotion, as he talks about very emotional taking of others' life, that's what you would come to. And his killings made no sense in terms of his stated manifesto, which was to kill pretty blonde girls. He was particularly fixated on the Alpha Phi sorority at UCSB. He actually didn't kill a single Alpha Phi. There were two girls standing outside of the house. They were both triadelphs at UCSB. The Alpha Phees heard him pounding at their door. 10 of them were inside, along with their house mother. They didn't let him in. But they witnessed what happened outside of the window, and they saw 3 girls shot, 1 seriously wounded, the other 2 dead. The young man was just out of his mind. He was out of his mind largely because his entire focus was on himself and on the gratification of sex. And I'm not a young man anymore, but when I was a young man, one of the things that I learned about dating was that early sex in a dating relationship almost always destroyed any potential for growth in that relationship. And that one-night stand sex was almost always unsatisfying. The moment it was over, you wished you could disappear, and the person beside you would disappear, and then it would go away. The things that make relationships wonderful and love wonderful are getting to know someone, sharing your life with them, becoming vulnerable to them, growing together, building a family, building a wonderful history together. It's the communication and the shared experiences that make life worth living. This young man was interested in the immediate gratification of sex and was frustrated that he didn't get any. But I'm telling you that if 100 girls had given him what he wanted, it would have made no difference. He would still have been unsatisfied. He was looking for the wrong things. The distraught father will go on, and I will share this with you in a moment, to blame the NRA, and although he doesn't say Republican, that's what he means, politicians. The fact is that the first 3 individuals that this man killed, he killed with a knife. They were his roommates, and he killed them with a knife. Someone who is dispassionate enough to kill 3 individuals with a knife and then calmly go out and kill others is mentally deranged. Welcome back to Shattering This. We're talking about the twisted world of Elliot Rodger, the murderer in the Santa Barbara community of Goleta, the residential area around the University of Santa Barbara. It happens to be about 10 minutes from where I am broadcasting this morning. The video that he produced shows that a young man who is detached from reality. There's no rage, there's no emotion. He's not even quietly calculating. You look at someone's eyes, and you learn to read individuals after a while, and there is nothing that he's even calculating in his head. He's numb. Literally emotionally numb. That's why I said that had 100 girls given him what he craved, it would have made no difference. He was way too far down the hole for redemption. Way too far gone for anything to please him. And he was way too self-centered. One of the reasons that individuals who are self-focused don't have relationships is they don't know how to approach someone. If you want, and I tell my sons this, I used to tell them regularly, one's now married, so I certainly don't tell him this anymore, but when they were dating, I said, if you want to go up and you want to meet a girl and you want the girl to be interested in you, be interested in her. Don't go up there and try to impress her with who you are. Instead, ask her questions about who she is. Everyone likes to talk about themselves. Engage as many young women as you see, just as you go through your life. by having conversations where you listen to who they are, what they care about, what they're interested in. Well, this is a young man that never fathomed that that was the right approach. His father was a movie producer, The Hunger Games, you know, the artificial world. In fact, that is really a depiction of an upside-down world. And maybe the father and mother never talked to him about these kinds of things. Now, I don't want to blame them. I don't know them. But there was certainly an inability to understand how you engage in relationships. And this was such a tragic situation because you will never find, is it possible that one day there will be an easier crime to stop than this one? Perhaps. But this was about as much of a lay-down hand as you're ever going to see in terms of being able to stop a crime. Here's a young man that those who lived around him said that he would constantly talk about his hatred of women and his desire to punish them. Here's a young man that posted his rage on his Facebook site and constantly published things that showed that he hated women and wanted to punish them. Here's a young man who was so overt in his hatred of women, his frustration with his own inability, his personal selfish fixation, that his parents sent the police to his apartment because they were concerned that he was going to harm someone else. The police could have easily checked his record. They could have easily poked around his apartment, but they didn't. They walked out. The police, if you want to hold someone accountable here, the psychiatrist or psychologist for not reporting this young man when he would have listened to his rage is guilty. The police for not dealing with this man's psychosis are guilty. The neighbors who never bothered to report him just knew that he was twisted in this way. We as a society, if we're going to be civil, have a responsibility when there are individuals who express their rage in this way, their hatred of individuals for selfish reasons, for artificial reasons. In this case, his rage was against women because they didn't give him the sex that he thought he deserved. And we have a responsibility to stand up, to expose and condemn them. And when we fail to do that, bad things happen. Now, when we return to Shattering Myths, I'll conclude Mr. Martinez's rant, and we will explore the consequence of the vast preponderance of people being unwilling to get involved, unwilling to take the risk to stand up, to expose and condemn murderers before they kill. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. There were two commercials that both promoted popular myths, and since the world has been twisted into believing these myths, I would like to expose them, since that is the purpose of today's program. There is no American service member who has sacrificed his or her life for the freedom of Americans. It's a myth. Not a single American service member sacrificed their life for the freedom of Americans. When we develop this program further, we'll talk about that, but that's a statement of fact. The U.S. military is not defending us. The Russians have no interest in attacking us, and actually we're provoking the Russians. The Chinese have no interest in invading and occupying America, and we're actually provoking them. There is no desire on behalf of Muslims to occupy the United States and to rob Americans of their freedoms. There is no enemy out there that the American military is defending us from. There is no war on terrorism. It's a myth. That's not to say that Muslims don't want to kill Muslims who disagree with them, and all non-Muslims, they do. It's part of their religion. But you don't defend yourself from a twisted ideology through bullets and bombs. All you do is make it worse. As a matter of fact, as we left the last segment, what I left you all pondering is that as a society, the vast preponderance of people today are just like the police who didn't remove this dangerous man from society to get him psychological help. They're just like those who lived in the apartments who listened to him rant and said nothing to anyone. It's just like those who read his online rants and didn't bother exposing him. When we see declarations of war against elements of humanity, and we do nothing about them, then we should not be surprised that innocent people die. Mr. Martinez, your son did not die because of the NRA. He did not die because of Republican politicians. He died because in a politically correct world, no one had the good sense, no one had the backbone, no one had the character to stand up and make a difference before it was too late. He said, why did Chris die? Chris died because of the craven, irresponsible politicians and the NRA. His craven, irresponsible politicians are Republicans. They didn't kill your son. Nor did the NRA. Had nothing to do with it. In fact, guns had virtually nothing to do with it. This young man killed his first 3 victims with a knife. He was attempting to use his car as a form of vehicular manslaughter. The gun was essentially irrelevant. When he wrote what he was attempting to do, the gun was an inappropriate object to accomplish it. He wanted to go into the Alpha Phi house and torture the girls to death. The reason he killed his roommates is he wanted his apartment to be transformed into his own personal torture chamber. He wanted to experience the agony of complete strangers. It's what happens when you become so self-centered that nothing can satiate your longings. Even watching cruelty, perpetrating cruelty, was not enough to jolt this individual back into reality. But that's what he wanted to do. A gun is inappropriate. It's the wrong implement to torture someone. The guns were irrelevant. He went on to say, when will the Sassanides stop? When will enough people say, stop this madness? We don't have to live like this. Too many have died. We should be seeing ourselves not one more. Here's the reality. If we take guns out of society, those who are vicious will attack with other weapons. Look what they do in the Middle East. They use clubs, they use rocks, they use Molotov cocktails, and they use knives. If we took the guns out of society, then all you would have is holding guns, and their absolute control would be governments. And they are all reprehensible. They will rob everyone of their freedom. The problem isn't guns. The problem is the consequence of political correctness that has rendered us incapable of being rational. Incapable of standing up, unwilling to stand up. To bow our back and say, no, this is a twisted world. Not my world, our world. And that someone who is willing to take the time to explore the manifestos of mass murderers before they perpetrate murder. There aren't enough of them. And so, just as we declare a war on a tactic, this man wants us to declare a war on an implement. The tactic is not responsible, nor is the implement. It's those deploying the tactic and deploying the implement. We have a serious problem in this country with people out of touch with reality, largely because reality no longer matters. In the world of political correctness, perceptions matter, the agenda matters, indoctrination matters, but not the truth. There is no longer a desire for people to make good judgments and to be judgmental and therefore moral and civil. In fact, the motivation is exactly the opposite, which is why we find ourselves in this problem. When the world finally comes to hate mass motivations for murder, as Mr. Martinez hates the Republican Party and the NRA, and when the world starts screaming against the manifestations and the manifestos that have and continue to kill millions, such as Islam, it's Quran. Instead of the none killed by the NRA and the 6 killed by Mr. Rogers' twisted world. Then, that kind of rage will be justified. That kind of rage will be beneficial. I read an article that I'm going to share with you in the second hour of this program today, and may even have to be postponed to tomorrow's first hour, on those 200-plus girls that were kidnapped and what happened to the first 5 of them along the way. And when the world comes to be enraged as to what happened to those girls, and the truth was known as to what happened to them weeks ago, and no one seems to be willing to stand up to say, this manifesto, this twisted world, has killed hundreds of millions, and it is still killing. We need to stop it. We need to stand up against it. We need to oppose it. And it's not the AK-47s that they're using that are responsible. It's not the Molotov cocktails that they're throwing. It's not the knives. No, it's not even the motorcycles that they ride as they perpetrate their harm. It's the ideology. It is the twisted world that they live in. And we need, as a society, if we wish to have any hope in stopping the madness and keeping more from dying, more individuals to stand up to the mass twisted worlds. It does no good to read about the twisted world of one Mr. Rogers. It does an enormous amount of good to read about the twisted world of Roman Catholicism and Islam. These are deadly regimes that have grown out of twisted ideologies. And when we examine them, expose them, raise our voices against them, then we can make a difference. Then we can thwart the madness. Then our rage is justified. It is then helpful. Other than Islam, where the plan is published in the Quran and Hadith, there will seldom, if ever, be a more easily preventable crime than the one that occurred in Isla Vista. Mr. Rogers told those living around him exactly what he was planning to do and why he was going to do it, and he posted his rage against women online. His parents called the police and asked them to intervene. They sent him to a psychologist. And yet, in a twisted celebration of law enforcement, the sheriff praised his staff to the way they responded. And yet, it was just the twisted world of one Elliot Rodger. Self-centered, fixated on himself. We have much larger twisted worlds. I mentioned patriotism, this notion that our military is responsible for providing our freedom. And yet it is through revisionist history and selective memory that we promote such propaganda, that we speak of manifest destiny and of wars being glorious and having achieved marvelous results. It's just not true. Let's speak just a little bit about the twisted world of patriotism, particularly as America celebrates Memorial Day with this constant appreciation for those who sacrificed their lives for our freedom, when, in fact, it just didn't happen. Of course, if you look at the most modern history and you go backwards, in Afghanistan, the president is now talking about peace with honor, a respectable withdrawal, a respectable end to the war. No, we made a bad situation worse in Afghanistan. That's the only rational way to look at it. Women are abused more frequently than they were before our invasion. There are vastly more terrorist acts in Afghanistan than there were before our invasion. The country is left with many more dead than there were prior to our invasion. And the moment we leave, the Taliban will come back and take control of that country. We didn't accomplish anything worthwhile in Afghanistan, and we made a bad situation worse. And there was no one in Afghanistan that was trying to invade America. So they certainly were not defending American freedom. If you go to the invasion of Iraq, the same situation exists. In fact, the problem with Iraq, of course, is we invaded Iraq on a pile of lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and there was no presence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time of our invasion. And so here we broke a country, led an invasion whereby almost 1 million people lost their lives, and we made a bad situation worse. We removed from power a secular dictator who was very effective in thwarting Islamic terrorism, and we replaced it with a government that is controlled by the mullahs in Tehran that are now free to develop their nuclear ambitions and who have profoundly influenced the world of the Middle East. And as a direct result of our invasion of Iraq, we have the proxy war in Syria, with hundreds of thousands losing their lives. We made a bad situation much worse in Iraq. Terrorism is up on an incalculable percentage from where it was before our invasion. That's the reality. We didn't preserve American freedom there. It's one of the reasons why there are hundreds of American vets that are being diagnosed with post-traumatic syndrome almost every day that were in Iraq. It's why some 80 Americans soldiers who served in either Iraq or Afghanistan take their own lives every day. Some between those who take their lives and those who report that they are now tormented and mentally unstable is in the 300 to 400 a day. We made bad situations worse in both encounters. We accomplished nothing worthwhile when we had boots in the ground in Somalia. Our bombing of Libya accomplished nothing worthwhile. We made a bad situation worse. The weapons we are supplying in Syria simply escalated the death toll. If you go back further, in Vietnam, we made a bad situation worse, and we sacrificed almost 60,000 American lives in the process. We did not achieve peace with honor. We sacrificed lives for nothing. Those who served there, many were honorable men and women. Many of them sacrificed a great deal. Many of them sacrificed their lives. But the reality is that if we project back on that, the myth that they sacrificed their lives for their country and for our freedom, then all we do is justify the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan on the same principle, and the principle is flawed. It's broken. It's not true. It is a lie. If you have to lie to promote your agenda is not worth promoting. And such is the stuff of patriotism, particularly when it wallows in the military. You know, if you want to look at World War II, and there are a very small number of survivors left who fought in World War II. In World War II, American military did not fight to defend America's freedom. There was no designs or any possibility that Adolf Hitler or Emperor Tito was going to invade America. They had no interest in invading and occupying America. They could not do so. And we will speak of that after the news and commercial break.